The year is 1937. The world is balanced precariously between the Great Depression and the shadow of global war. But for the American public, one figure still embodies the limitless potential of the human spirit: Amelia Earhart. She was more than just a pilot. She was a symbol of courage, a beacon for women's rights, and an icon of the rapidly expanding age of aviation. Having already conquered the Atlantic solo, the last great challenge remaining was the ultimate prize, a circumnavigation of the globe near its equator, the longest and most perilous route conceivable. This was to be the defining flight of her career, the fulfillment of a lifelong dream, and, tragically, the stage for one of history's most compelling and enduring mysteries. Earhart's aircraft was the Lockheed Electra 10E, a state-of-art twin-engine monoplane, specially modified for the monumental journey. Crucially, the aircraft had been stripped of non-essential amenities and outfitted with extra fuel tanks, effectively transforming it into a flying gas station. This modification provided the necessary range for the longest, most remote legs of the flight, but it also left minimal space for survival gear and added significant weight, increasing the risk during takeoff and landing. The stakes were impossibly high, but for Earhart, they were secondary to the quest for the horizon. To navigate this vast, uncharted realm, she chose Frederick J. Noonan, a highly regarded and experienced navigator renowned for his expertise in celestial navigation. Noonan had previously charted Pacific air routes for Pan American Airways, and his skill was considered essential for finding tiny islands scattered across the massive ocean, where the smallest navigational error could mean oblivion. The journey began not once, but twice. An initial attempt in March 1937, starting from the west to the east, ended abruptly in Hawaii after a ground loop accident severely damaged the Electra. This forced a lengthy repair and a complete re-evaluation. Undeterred, Earhart, Noonan, and her husband, publisher George P. Putnam, reorganized the flight. They chose a new itinerary, moving from east to west, a strategic decision influenced by prevailing winds and weather patterns, even though it meant they would face the most daunting legs: the vast Pacific crossings, at the very end of their exhausting journey. This second successful start launched from Miami, Florida, on June 1, 1937. The first 30 days of the second attempt were a triumph of organization and endurance. Earhart and Noonan covered nearly 22,000 miles of the planned 29,000-mile route. They flew across the Atlantic, over the deserts of Africa, across the Arabian Peninsula, through the complex monsoon climates of Southeast Asia, and down to Australia. At every stop, she was met with fanfare, her progress meticulously documented by the world press, a constant reminder of the public's intense investment in her success. The flight had pushed the limits of aviation, testing the Electra, the crew, and the global infrastructure of the 1930s. Every leg was a navigational feat, every landing a victory. On June 29, 1937, they landed in Lae, New Guinea. They had successfully traversed 3/4 of the globe. Only 3 flights remained: the colossal leap from Lae to Howland Island, followed by a flight to Honolulu, and finally, the home stretch to Oakland, California. The Lae to Howland leg was, however, the most perilous of the entire expedition. It was a 556-mile journey over open water, a stretch so vast and featureless that finding the destination, a tiny, remote coral sliver just 2 miles long and barely 20 feet above sea level, was, as one historian described it, like finding a needle on a beach that stretched for 1,000 miles. It was a navigational puzzle, with potentially fatal consequences for the slightest miscalculation. The fate of the entire mission, and indeed the lives of Earhart and Noonan, rested on the ability of Fred Noonan to calculate a precise course, and the ability of the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca to provide the radio guidance necessary for the final approach. The Itasca had been specially positioned near Howland Island to act as a floating lighthouse, a critical communication and homing beacon. Despite the intense preparation, the technological shortcomings of the era, especially in long-distance radio and direction finding, would soon conspire with the cruel realities of the Pacific weather and the simple limitations of fuel, turning a glorious challenge into an irreversible disaster. The stage was set for the final, tragic act of Amelia Earhart's extraordinary life. The final fatal leg of the circumnavigation began on July 2, 1937. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan lifted off from the runway in Lae, New Guinea, at approximately 10:00 a.m. local time. Their destination, Howland Island, roughly 18 hours and 556 miles away, due east, across the international date line. Their Lockheed Electra was fully fueled, carrying nearly 150 gallons of gasoline, enough for an estimated 20 to 21 hours of flight, allowing for a modest safety reserve in ideal conditions. However, the conditions they faced were far from ideal. From the start, the elements conspired against them, despite careful planning. The aircraft encountered unexpectedly strong headwinds throughout much of the flight. These headwinds significantly reduced their ground speed and, critically, dramatically, increased the effective distance of the journey. What was intended as an 18-hour flight was effectively extended to nearly 21 hours in terms of fuel consumption. The subtle enemy of the headwind was relentlessly consuming the precious few hours of reserve fuel, transforming the margin of safety into a rapidly shrinking window of peril. As they flew across the vast, featureless expanse of the Pacific, Fred Noonan relied entirely on celestial navigation. In this era before satellites and sophisticated radar, a navigator had to use a sextant to take precise sightings of the sun, moon, and stars, calculating their position relative to the celestial sphere. This method was notoriously difficult to execute accurately from a shaking, noisy airplane, especially one that lacked an astrodome, a feature the Electra did not have, forcing Noonan to take sights through side windows or a small overhead hatch, further compromising precision. Furthermore, continuous cloud cover during the final hours of the flight likely prevented Noonan from getting the critical final sun line fix he needed to pinpoint Howland Island's position. The radio communication between the Electra and the Coast Guard cutter Itasca, positioned at Howland, became the ultimate point of failure. The Itasca was equipped with a radio direction finder, ZAR-DF, which could theoretically guide Earhart to the island by providing continuous, accurate bearings. However, two major problems plagued the final hours. First, the Itasca's personnel were frustrated by Earhart's inability to receive the precise Morse code signals necessary for a clear direction finding procedure. Earhart preferred voice communication, but was not proficient in decoding the continuous wave LCW signals needed for accurate bearings. Second, the Itasca was unable to obtain a clear radio bearing from the Electra. The Coast Guard crew continually requested Earhart to transmit a long, steady signal, which their equipment required, but the transmissions she sent were often too short, too sporadic, or too garbled. This meant the Itasca could not tell Earhart exactly where she was relative to the island, and Earhart, now relying almost entirely on the ship's signal, was effectively flying blind toward an invisible target. The fatal communication breakdown was a deadly ballot of incompatible technology and mismanaged protocol. At approximately 7:42 a.m. Holland time and 20 hours and 13 minutes into the flight, Amelia Earhart's voice crackled through the static to the Itasca with her famous, chilling message. KHAQQ, calling Itasca. We must be on you, but cannot see you. Fuel is running low. Have been flying for a half hour. This transmission confirmed their arrival in the vicinity of Howland. But, due to Noonan's inability to get a precise fix, they couldn't spot the island, which, being so low, lying, would have been difficult to see from the air. The final garbled transmission came at 8:43 a.m. Earhart reported they were flying along the line of position 157-337. This was a crucial piece of information. A northwest to southeast line that ran directly through the area where Noonan believed Howland Island should be. They were now flying parallel to their target, desperately searching for the tiny speck, their fuel gauge ticking closer to empty. The subsequent radio silence was absolute, plunging the vast, empty Pacific into an enduring, deafening mystery. Following the devastating radio silence at 8:43 a.m. on July 2nd, the initial, immediate assumption by the U.S. government, and the majority of the subsequent investigations, has been the simplest and most tragic explanation. The plane ran out of fuel, crashed, and sank into the deep Pacific Ocean. This crash and sink theory remains the most widely accepted and officially supported conclusion regarding the fate of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan. The arithmetic of the final flight strongly supports this theory. As the last transmissions were received, the Electra had been airborne for approximately 20 hours and 13 minutes. Given the strong headwind encountered and the subsequent increase in fuel consumption, most experts agree that by the time of the final garbled message, the plane would have had less than 1 hour's worth of fuel remaining. The aircraft was, quite literally, a flying gas tank designed for range, not for comfortable reserve. The reality is stark after 21 hours of flight. The fuel tanks were practically dry. The location of the crash, under this primary theory, is in the deep waters of the Central Pacific, most likely along the 157-337 line of position, and in the immediate vicinity of Howland Island. The ocean floor in this region plunges to depths of 16,000 feet or more, creating an incredibly challenging environment for any search or recovery operation. Once the Electra hit the water, the impact, even in a controlled ditch, would have been substantial. The heavy fuselage, weighted by the engines and the extensive structure of the aircraft, would have quickly breached and plunged to the crushing depths. The U.S. Navy and Coast Guard immediately launched an unprecedented search and rescue effort, the most extensive in American history up to that time. The search involved the aircraft carrier USS Lexington and the battleship USS Colorado, along with numerous destroyers and reconnaissance aircraft, including PBY Catalinas. They scoured a search grid of approximately 250,000 square miles around Howland Island over a period of 2 weeks. Despite the massive scale of the operation, no conclusive trace of the plane, its crew, or any wreckage was ever found. This official lack of evidence further cemented the belief that the plane sank almost immediately. Critics of the crash and sink theory often point to the unusually large area searched by the Navy as evidence of the inherent uncertainty in their final position. They argue that if the plane was truly out of fuel and near Howland, the search should have been concentrated in a much tighter area. However, navigational errors, combined with the difficulty of predicting the exact ditching location and the strong ocean currents that would have dispersed any floating debris justified the wide search radius. The sheer vastness of the empty Pacific was the primary antagonist in this tragedy. Ultimately, the official conclusion delivered by the U.S. Navy and the Coast Guard after the search was suspended on July 19, 1937, was that Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan perished at sea when their aircraft ran out of fuel and sank. This remains the pragmatic, unromantic, yet highly probable explanation. While the mystery endures, the technical and logistical realities of the flight strongly align with a catastrophic failure to find the target, followed by an inevitable, fatal plunge into the ocean depths. The most compelling and heavily investigated alternative to the official conclusion is the Nikumaroro hypothesis, sometimes referred to as the Gardner Island hypothesis. This theory proposes that Earhart and Noonan, unable to find tiny Howland Island, did not immediately crash, but instead turned south-southeast, following their final line of position, 157 degrees, flying for another 2 to 3 hours until they reached the much larger, uninhabited coral atoll then known as Gardner Island, now called Nikumaroro. The hypothesis suggests that the pair, desperately short on fuel, spotted the island, descended, and successfully executed a controlled landing on the smooth, wide reef flat that encircles the atoll, likely at low tide. This would explain the continued post-loss radio transmissions reported by listeners across the Pacific, suggesting the plane was initially intact and capable of generating power. These reported radio calls, dismissed by the Navy as hoaxes, are a cornerstone of the Nikumaroro theory. If even one of them was genuine, the plane must have landed on land. The International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, TIGAR, has led more than a dozen expeditions to Nikumaroro since 1989, uncovering what they believe to be circumstantial, yet highly suggestive, evidence. Among the artifacts recovered are pieces of 1930s-era U.S. toiletries, a woman's shoe heel consistent with the size and style Earhart wore, and a fragment of aluminum sheeting that forensic analysis suggests could have come from the Electra's fuselage. These artifacts, found scattered around a former colonial campsite, point toward the presence of castaways in the late 1930s. Perhaps the most significant evidence is the discovery of human bones on the island in 1940. A colonial officer found a partial skeleton, which was sent to Fiji for analysis. The original British forensic analysis determined the bones belonged to a stocky male, leading to their dismissal as evidence of Earhart. However, modern forensic re-analysis, led by anthropologist Richard Jantz, using the original measurements and applying modern techniques to infer sex, stature, and ancestry, concluded that the bones were more consistent with a female of European ancestry of Earhart's height and build than 99% of a reference sample. While the original bones are now lost, this re-analysis strongly suggests they were Earhart's remains. TIGAR also maintains that a 1937 photo taken from a search plane, 7 days after the disappearance, shows what appears to be a landing gear and a section of the Electra's fuselage resting on the reef flat near the wreck of the freighter, Norwich City. The pilots of that search plane dismissed the signs of recent habitation they saw, assuming the island was populated, which it was not. Had they investigated the reef, the entire mystery might have been solved within days. The Nikumaroro hypothesis posits a grim, but not instantaneous, fate. Earhart and Noonan survived the landing, but died as castaways due to injury, dehydration, or starvation. The tide and waves would have eventually washed the Electra off the reef and into the deep, ocean trench surrounding the island, explaining why the Navy search failed to find it. This theory appeals to the romantic sensibility that Earhart achieved her goal of finding land, only to be denied rescue by a tragic stroke of bad luck and poor communication. The allure of the unsolved mystery inevitably gives rise to more complex, often sensational, theories that seek to fill the historical void with espionage and political intrigue. The most prominent of these involves the Japanese capture theory, which gained significant traction in the 1960s and persists in popular culture today. This theory suggests that Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan, for various reasons, did not crash at sea but were captured by the Imperial Japanese military and executed or died in captivity. The political context of 1937 provides the backdrop for this speculation. At the time, the Imperial Japanese Navy was aggressively expanding its presence across the Pacific, particularly in the islands that were part of its South Seas mandate. The U.S. government, while officially maintaining neutrality, was highly interested in gathering intelligence on Japanese military build up on these strategically vital islands. This secrecy and political tension fueled the rumors. The core of the Japanese capture theory suggests that Earhart and Noonan were U.S. government spies flying a reconnaissance mission under the guise of a world flight. The Electra was, after all, packed with long-range radio equipment and cameras. Proponents argue that they either intentionally or accidentally strayed into Japanese-controlled territory, such as the Marshall Islands or Saipan in the northern Mariana Islands. Upon landing or crashing, they were allegedly seized by Japanese forces. Reports from veterans and local residents who were in the region during and after 1937 have fueled this speculation. Multiple accounts emerged decades later, often second-hand, claiming to have seen a white woman pilot and her navigator being held by Japanese troops on Saipan or another island. Some of these accounts even claim to have witnessed their execution. While the U.S. government and subsequent investigations have consistently dismissed these reports as unsubstantiated wartime propaganda or misremembered stories, they continue to hold a powerful grip on the popular imagination. Another related, and equally sensational, subset of the Japanese theory suggests that Earhart was deliberately flying over Japanese islands to take surveillance photos for President Franklin D. Roosevelt. This theory proposes a deliberate mission of espionage that ended with their capture. However, there is zero credible documentary evidence to support the idea that Earhart was an agent of the U.S. government, or that her flight was anything other than the pursuit of a record-breaking aviation milestone. Furthermore, her route was largely determined by logistics, not by military intelligence needs. More mundane, but still outside the mainstream, theories include the idea that Earhart survived, returned to the U.S. secretly, and lived under an assumed identity. This theory, often attributed to fanciful newspaper accounts, is generally dismissed by all serious historians due to its sheer implausibility and lack of supporting evidence. Earhart was too famous to disappear into obscurity, and her husband, George P. Putnam, spent years and a great deal of money trying to locate her, a fact that contradicts any secrecy claims. Ultimately, while the Japanese capture theory provides a dramatic, compelling narrative of wartime intrigue, the overwhelming evidence, both historical and scientific, supports a more prosaic, tragic conclusion that the Electra met its end in the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the Pacific Ocean, either immediately upon fuel exhaustion near Howland Island or a few hours later as castaways on the desolate shores of Nikumaroro. The conspiracy theories, however, thrive on the very fact that the official search yielded no body and no plane, leaving a perpetual void for speculation to fill. The disappearance of Amelia Earhart is not just a mystery of location. It is also a tragic case study in the catastrophic failure of 1930s radio technology and communication protocol. The final hours of the flight were a continuous, frustrating sequence of technical mishaps and miscommunication that sealed their fate far more certainly than any Japanese spy ring. The fundamental issue lay in the incompatibility between the Electra's radio system and the advanced direction finding equipment on the USCGC Itasca. The ship's radio direction finder RDF, the key to the entire operation, was designed to lock onto a continuous wave LCW Morse code signal. It required the transmitting aircraft to hold down the transmission key for at least 30 seconds to obtain a clean, accurate bearing. Earhart, though she had a CW transmitter, was not proficient in Morse code and preferred voice communication. She sent brief, sporadic voice transmissions, which the Itasca could not use for direction finding. Conversely, the Itasca's personnel attempted to transmit direction finding signals to the Electra using the CW method. The standard procedure was to transmit a sequence of signals, allowing the pilot to tune the on-board antenna and receive a clear audio signal that indicated their bearing to the source. Earhart, though she had the proper equipment, struggled to properly operate the complex prototype Bendix ADF receiver and was unable to decode the Itasca's signals effectively. This created a deadlock. The Itasca couldn't plot her, and she couldn't plot the Itasca. A major operational error was the lack of a voice-based direction finder on the Itasca. While voice communication was possible, the superior accuracy of the Morse code CW signal was favored for navigation. Had the Coast Guard been equipped with a direction finder that could accurately use Earhart's voice transmissions, the entire scenario might have been resolved in minutes. This reliance on outdated, complex Morse code for a pilot who was known to struggle with it was a critical failure of mission planning. Furthermore, the flight plan contained a significant timing error related to the international date line. When the Electra crossed the line, the date changed from July 2nd to July 3rd in Howland Island time. This time difference, though seemingly minor, confused the Itasca's crew, who initially expected the plane much later than it arrived. More critically, the low-frequency LF radio signal they used was notoriously vulnerable to atmospheric interference and solar activity, which further compounded the static and garbled nature of the transmissions in the early morning hours. Finally, there was the human element. Earhart and Noonan had been flying for over 20 hours. Fatigue, stress, and the desperate search for the island would have severely impaired their judgment and their ability to troubleshoot the radio issues. Noonan was likely physically sick from the fumes of the oil pump used in the cabin, further hindering his focus on the already daunting task of celestial navigation. The communication failure was thus a perfect storm of technical incompatibility, protocol errors, the limitations of the era's radio technology, and the severe fatigue of the crew. They were in the right place, within a 100-mile radius of their target, but the complex technological lock needed to land them safely was never achieved. The disappearance of Amelia Earhart serves as a chilling, permanent testament to the merciless, unforgiving nature of the early aviation age. The initial search for the Lockheed Electra ended in July 1937, but the quest for answers has continued relentlessly for over 8 decades. The disappearance of Amelia Earhart remains one of the world's most enduring cold cases, driving an almost spiritual commitment from researchers, historians, and deep-sea exploration teams. This modern search is a relentless race against time, decay, and the crushing depths of the Pacific. The advancement of deep-sea technology has been the primary engine of the modern search. Companies and organizations specializing in deep ocean exploration have utilized autonomous underwater vehicles, UVs, and highly sophisticated side-scan sonar equipment capable of mapping the ocean floor with incredible detail. These tools are designed to detect metallic anomalies or debris fields that might represent the wreckage of the Electra, potentially lying in water deeper than the Grand Canyon. The search efforts can be broadly categorized into 2 geographic zones: the immediate vicinity of Howland Island, supporting the crash and sink theory, and the area around Nicomarro Island, supporting the castaway hypothesis. Deep sea searches near Howland have been the focus of numerous expeditions, including those by the U.S. Navy and the private company Nauticos, using sophisticated sonar to comb the predicted line of position. While several intriguing metallic anomalies have been detected, none have yet been definitively confirmed as the Lockheed Electra. The most recent and highly publicized discovery came in early 2024, when the private firm Deep Sea Vision released a sonar image taken 5,000 meters deep, about 100 miles west of Howland Island. The image showed a blurry but distinct object resembling an airplane fuselage and wings. While its location, far west of the final line of position, has raised skepticism, its shape is highly suggestive. The company plans a return trip to confirm the identity of the object using a remotely operated vehicle, ROV, a development that has once again ignited global interest. Meanwhile, the efforts surrounding Nicomarro continue to be driven by TIGEC, focusing both on land and in the water. Expeditions have used sonar to search the steep underwater slopes around the island, looking for a debris field that would result from the plane being washed off the reef. The evidence, the bones, the artifacts, the post-loss radio calls, suggests the wreckage should be there, but the challenging terrain and the immense depths have, thus far, prevented a definitive discovery. The constant search for the plane is perpetually hindered by the immense cost and logistical difficulty of operating in such a remote area of the Pacific. Each major expedition can cost millions of dollars, yet the vastness of the ocean, the decay of the aluminum structure over time, and the deep, rugged underwater canyons all conspire to make the search effort akin to finding a single bullet in a continent. Until a piece of wreckage with a verifiable serial number, such as the landing gear or a portion of the distinctive Electra tail, is recovered and confirmed, the search will continue. The modern technology gives hope that the ocean can finally yield its secret, transforming one of history's great mysteries into a historical fact. For now, however, the disappearance remains one of the most frustrating, costly, and enduring quests in aviation history. The story of Amelia Earhart transcends the mere circumstances of her disappearance. It is a powerful, persistent narrative that speaks to the very heart of human curiosity, ambition, and tragedy. The fact that the mystery remains unsolved is, paradoxically, what has cemented her legend as an immortal icon of aviation and exploration. The enduring power of the mystery rests on a few key pillars. Firstly, There is the symbolism of the figure herself. Earhart was not just a pilot. She was an emblem of the nascent 20th century ideal of the unlimited potential of women and the triumph of technology over nature. Her disappearance became a cautionary tale about the hubris of pushing boundaries. Yet her memory remains an inspiration. Her loss in the vast, unforgiving Pacific elevated her from a mortal record, set her to an almost mythical figure, forever frozen at the peak of her ambition. Secondly, the mystery is sustained by the lack of closure and the tantalizing, yet non-definitive evidence. The simple fact that the plane and the bodies were never recovered creates a void that fuels speculation. If the plane had been found immediately, the event would have been catalogued as a tragedy. Instead, it became an enigma. The conflicting, plausible theories, the prosaic crash at sea versus the romantic castaway tale, allow the public to choose the narrative that best suits their imagination, ensuring the discussion and debate never truly end. The disappearance also served as a brutal lesson for aviation and the military. The profound failures in radio communication, the poor positioning of rescue assets, and the reliance on complex, fragile navigation techniques spurred significant advancements in long-distance communication and safety protocols. Her final flight highlighted the need for more robust, standardized air-sea communication systems and better survival training for long-over-water flights. The tragedy ultimately made flying safer for future generations. In the end, Amelia Earhart's final flight serves as a permanent reminder of the merciless nature of the frontier. She and Fred Noonan were pioneers in the truest sense, pushing the limits of technology and human endurance in a world that was still far too vast and wild for the tools they possessed. Their fate, whether sealed by a quick plunge into the ocean near Howland or a desperate, prolonged wait on the remote reef of Nikumaroro, remains a high-stakes lesson in human fallibility and the power of the unknown. The quest to find the Electra will inevitably continue, driven by the hope that one day a piece of barnacle-encrusted metal will finally yield the definitive answer. But until then, the enduring legend of the woman who soared higher than most and vanished without a trace will continue to inspire, mystify, and eternally ask the simple, haunting question: what really happened to Amelia Earhart?